Let's review what we've learned about event-controlled loops. Pause the video and try to write this program. Write a program that calculates a total distance for a trip. Ask the user to enter the distance between two cities or a negative number to quit. When the user is done entering data and you've calculated the total, then print out the result. Let's think through our solution. We're going to need a few items in our program. So first, we know that we're creating a event-controlled repetition statement. So we're going to need an initialization, and we're going to need a loop control. And then indented, we'll need to have a loop body, the items that we want to repeat. And we'll also need an update step. Loop control variables. And then we know at the end of the program, we want to print out the result. So it's just building some scaffolding for our program. We know the kind of big picture steps that we want to include in our algorithm. Then we can focus on the low-level details. So let's think about what our program's supposed to do. It's supposed to calculate the total distance for a trip. So in addition to the initialization step for our loop control, I think we're also going to need a variable that keeps track of the total distance. And that's going to be an accumulator variable. I'm going to initialize that to 0 to start out, to represent the fact that so far we don't know any distances. So far our trip is non-existent. We haven't gone anywhere. And now the description says we need to ask the user to enter a distance between two cities or a negative number to quit. That's going to be our initialization step for our loop control. Something where we ask the user to enter the distance between two cities. And I'm imagining the distance could be a fractional quantity, and so I'm going to typecast it as a float. If you want to make yours an integer, that's okay. Asking the user to enter the distance between two cities or a negative number to quit. So now I want to create my loop control. I know I'm going to need the reserved word while to show that I'm using repetition. And then in my parentheses, I want to include statement that is true if I want to continue and false if I want to stop. So I know I want to stop if the user enters a negative number. So my while loop is going to be while the distance that they enter is greater than or equal to 0. And then I'm going to include my loop body. I want to calculate the total distance for the trip. So I'm going to use my accumulator, total distance. And I want to take the current value of that variable, total distance, and add on to it the new distance that the user just entered. That'll be total distance equals total distance plus distance. And now finally, I'm ready for my update step. I need to do something where I get a new distance value. And in this program, it's going to be asking the user for a new distance input. Let's stop and run the program just up to that point to see if we've made any syntax errors or if things are behaving the way we want them to. Ask me to enter a distance. So let's say I enter 5.2, and then asks me to enter a distance between the next two cities. Let's say I say 6.3, and then enter the distance between the next two cities. Let's say that's 4.5. And then let's say I enter a negative number. So the program stops. Now it didn't display my result. That's because we didn't add that final statement. But so far it looks like it's doing what I want it to do. It stopped executing at the right time. Whenever I entered the negative number, it stopped repeating. And in all the cases where I entered a positive number, it did repeat the algorithm. So I just need to add my label into the program and print out the result. My result is what's stored in this variable total distance. All right, let's try that out. Suppose we do 5.2, 6.3, and 3.5. So it tells us the average score is 5. Let's think if that's right. So we have 5.2 and 6.3, that's 11.5. And then 11.5 plus 3.5, that is 15. And 15 divided by 3 is 5.0. So that's right. Let's go back and try some fill in the blanks. This last part reviews some of the vocabulary from this particular module. First, every loop has 4 parts. Can you remember what they are? Pause the video and see if you can think which loop piece fits into each of these different blanks. So the blank step happens before the loop and sets up the correct starting value for the variables. That's the initialization step. Remember, in the count controlled loop, that's where we set count equal to 0. If it's an event controlled loop, it could have any format. It just has to be something that initializes the variable or the variables that are used in our loop control Boolean condition. Next, the blank is a Boolean expression that determines whether to perform the instructions within the loop body or skip them. There's a lot of different words that you can use to describe that. It is the loop test or loop control, or sometimes you'll see it as the loop condition. All of those mean the same thing. You can use any of those terms on a quiz or an exam or a conversation you're having about your program. The blank of the loop contains the instructions that should be repeated. That's the body of the loop. That means all of the statements in the algorithm that we want to repeat. And then finally, the update step is the part of the loop body in which the value of the variable or variables are modified to make the expression eventually evaluate to false at the correct time. And finally, what's the Python reserved word that indicates that we want to write a loop in our program? Remember the reserved word that's in Python that means create a repetition statement? It's while. And we use that for both count controlled and event controlled loop situations. At this point, you should understand the concept of repetition statements, recognize examples of definite and indefinite loops, in other words, count controlled and event controlled loops, and be able to write both types of loops using the while syntax.